I'm Jim English. I'm the director of the center, and on behalf of our co-sponsors tonight, the Penn Political Science Department, also our associate director, Sarah Varney, and our topic director this year, Emily Wilson. I wanted to thank you all for coming. Emily is sorry not to be here. She had to be away this week to do promotional events for her translation of the Odyssey. She's here now this week. It is it's really something. We're thrilled, all of us at the Center for the Publicity and Attention. It is rightly attracting to her and her work. So she'll be back next week. Our event next week features Catherine Hales, the brilliant scholar of new media and new technologies and culture. Back in 1999, at the peak of the dot-com boom, Hales wrote her most influential book, How We Became Post-Human. And since that time, this concept of the post-human and forms of post-human life and thought and fields of post-human study and research have all proliferated greatly. So Professor Hales is going to come back, bring us up to date on sort of the afterlives of her book and of this concept that she helped to put into play. She'll try to answer the question, what comes after the post-human? Kate is a great speaker. She's a great teacher. You always learn something memorable from her. So I'm pitching this event to you. Nice thing about this job is there's no need to be cynical. I can just speak the truth from my heart. It's going to be a good event, just as this will be tonight. So today, it's the day after Election Day, and I'm feeling okay. I'm in one piece. I can't say that was the case a year ago. We do our events on Wednesday. We had an event on the Wednesday after the Election Day last year. It was a pretty big event. We worked hard on the planning and preparation for that. And it came in to the room, and I think, like most of the people felt the way I did, which was physically ill. I had truly lost my equilibrium, and it took several days to get anything, get anywhere near my former self back. I think that many of our fears have since proven justified. Right? Some of the most hateful and willfully ignorant sectors of our society have been greatly emboldened. Stark divisions have appeared where they were not there before, where we had reasonable consensus. I'll give one example that really hits home for us here on the Penn campus. 2 years ago, there was broad agreement among Americans that a strong higher educational system was good for the country. Today, a majority of Republicans says that colleges and universities have a negative effect on America. That's a new thing. The answers to that question have never been negative by a majority in either party. That's just one distressing feature of our current situation, our collective life 1 year after. In developing a series of events for the Afterlives program, Emily and I wanted to include a speaker who could help us put this distressing political afterlife into historical and comparative cultural context. And we knew just who we wanted. No one could be better qualified for the task than Jan-Werner Mueller. Professor Mueller comes to us this afternoon from Princeton, just 50 miles away, but his training and teaching and research extend across multiple countries in Europe and beyond. He was educated in Berlin, London, Oxford, and Princeton, and has held appointments at universities and institutes in Paris, Berlin, Florence, Budapest, and Helsinki, Vienna, as well as at Oxford and at Harvard. His work, 9 books and counting, 80-odd articles, and regular vigorous journalistic pieces that you may have seen in journals like The Guardian, Boston Review, LRB. His work spans the history of political thought, of liberal democracy, and of populist movements in 20th century Europe. His first books, Another Country and a Dangerous Mind, focused on German political thought, still the area of his most sustained scholarly attention. In recent years, though, he has published more synoptic, comparative studies Contesting Democracy, an account of 20th century political thought in Eastern as well as Western Europe, was published in 2011. And What Was Populism? His bracing primer on a decidedly slippery and often incoherent subject was published in Germany in 2016 and released in an English edition by our own Penn Press later that year. It has been, for all the right reasons, a book of wide appeal and interest and impact, translated already into more than a dozen languages. Professor Mueller brings to these large and weighty subjects great clarity as to the stakes and consequences involved. Populists can govern, he warns us. We might think otherwise based on the hapless, meandering, strange governance that we're looking at these days. But populists can govern. Concretely, they will engage in occupying the state, in mass clientelism and corruption, and in the suppression of anything like a critical civil society. And he adds that they will do this openly and avowedly, knowing that their base will warmly support. But Mueller's analyses, unlike much of the commentary I find myself reading these days, do not lead to mere hand-wringing or despair. What he offers us are the tools of historical and theoretical understanding that we need if we're going to advance more progressive ideas, policies, and candidates on the inhospitable ground of today's political landscape. It is indeed an honor and a great pleasure to welcome Jan Mueller to the Wolf Humanities Center. Please join me.
Our era is characterized by an absolutely inflationary use of the word populism. All kinds of actors, left, right, even center, are nowadays called populists. Even poor Emmanuel Macron, during the French presidential elections this past spring, at one point was called a populist. People accused him of being a populist of the extreme center. Whatever the hell that meant, exactly. Moreover, as you all know, up until, well, to be precise, up until March 16th this year, the day after the elections in the Netherlands, there was a virtually omnipresent narrative according to which what was often called the global wave, or as Nigel Farage, for whom the metaphor of the wave was apparently too small, put it, the global tsunami of populism, which was now inevitable and which, starting with Brexit and then Trump, was going to wash away elites and the so-called establishment everywhere. After the Dutch elections, and then more specifically after the French elections, the story changed in many media. All of a sudden, we were often told that we might already be living in what some observers then started to call the post-populist moment. And then come the fall, things again didn't look quite so rosy with elections in Germany and more recently in Austria and the Czech Republic. Ladies and gentlemen, I believe that all these seemingly clear-cut narratives about waves going this way or waves going that way are deeply misleading. And I want to say a little bit about why I think they are so misleading. But before getting there, allow me first of all to present you with an account of what, at least I think, populism actually is. Then, as a kind of second chapter of my remarks tonight, say something about something that Jim English already alluded to, namely the question whether populists can actually govern or not. And then thirdly, in keeping with the topic of your events this year, let me try to offer some reflections, well, it's actually already too much, not even reflections, about what we can possibly learn from this experience with populism across the West over the last couple of years. What deeper questions about democracy, what kind of structural questions about what might be problematic about democracy in our day can we possibly derive from this experience? And there'll really be more questions, I'll warn you, than answers, but hopefully they'll help us also to open up a debate later on this evening. So first chapter, What is actually populism? Well, the conventional wisdom of our day, the kind of stuff you read every day in newspapers or as soon as we switch on the TV or look in the internet, is of course that populists are those who, as the cliched phrase tends to go, are criticizing the elites, or as another widespread sentence usually goes, it's a matter of the people rising up against the establishment. When you think about it, it's actually a very peculiar thought. Any old civics textbook would have told you that it's actually a sign of good democratic engagement, that citizens keep a close eye on the powerful, whether they be in politics, the economy, in culture, or for that matter, even in universities. And all of a sudden, at the beginning of the 21st century, we're constantly told that anybody who actually does that might be somehow a danger to democracy. Well, when populists are in opposition, they criticize the governments. In that sense, they criticize the powerful. But above all, I believe they do something else. One way or the other, they all end up saying that they and only they represent what populists typically call the real people, or also very often the silent majority. Now, at first sight, this might not sound so bad. This is not, let's say, immediately the same thing as racism, or let's say in the European context, immediately the same thing as a fanatical hatred of the European Union. And yet, I believe that it always has two detrimental, or to put it more sharply, two dangerous consequences for democracy. First of all, populists will always end up saying, in one way or the other, that all other contenders for power are fundamentally illegitimate. And this is never just a matter of disagreeing about policy or even disagreeing about values, which in a democracy, of course, is completely normal and ideally productive. No, populists always immediately make it moral, and they always immediately make it personal. The problem is always that the others are characters who are corrupt or, to coin a phrase, crooked. What the man who now occupies the White House said during the campaign 2015-2016, to be sure, was extreme, but it was not really an exception. I think that populists always talk this way in one way or another. Secondly, and maybe less obviously, populists are also going to suggest that all those citizens, all, if you like, among the people themselves, who do not share their ultimately symbolic construction of the supposedly real people, and who hence logically do not support the populists politically, that with all those citizens, you can basically put their status as properly belonging to the people into doubt. Let me try to illustrate that less obvious thought with two examples. Many of you will also remember the speech that Nigel Farage, the former leader of the UK Independence Party, still gave during the night of Brexit, when he famously or infamously said that this had been, as he put it, a victory for real people. Implying, of course, that the 48% who wanted to stay inside the European Union, well, on one level, weren't quite real, didn't properly belong to the British, or maybe in the case of Farage specifically, the English people. Donald Trump, in May 2016, gave a campaign speech which went virtually unnoticed, given all the other kinds of stuff that he tended to say during campaign speeches. But it was a deeply revealing remark when he said, I'm quoting from memory, the most important thing is the unification of the people, because all the other people don't matter. I hope you can see where this is going. Populists always, in one way or another, exclude. They exclude at the level of party politics and the other politicians, and less obviously, they exclude at the level of the people themselves. So if you find this plausible as an account, the important lesson would be that what matters about populism is not anti-elitism. Any of us can criticize the powerful. It doesn't mean that we're right in what we say, but this is not obviously immediately something dangerous for democracy, and very often can be the contrary. What is dangerous about populism is the inherent anti-pluralism, the tendency always to exclude at the level of party politics and at the level of the people themselves. Now, before opening my second chapter and saying something about populism and power, let me underline one consequence of this account that might be worth also bearing in mind. Even when populists don't win at the ballot box, there's very often a peculiar kind of damage that they do to a democratic political culture. What do I mean? If you find anything plausible in what I've been saying so far, then you might say that any populist who doesn't win elections or who doesn't get overwhelming majorities at the ballot box has an almost logical problem. For how can it be that we and only we populists represent the people, and at the same time we don't win elections? That cannot really be the case. So very often, I'm not saying they always do that, but very often the way populists respond to this conundrum is the following. In essence, they take a second look at that infamous expression, the silent majority. By definition, if the majority weren't silent, they would always already be in power. So maybe the fact that they aren't in power points us to the fact that we're not really talking about the silent majority, but we're talking about, according to populists, the silenced majority. For surely, elites must have been manipulating things behind the scenes in order to prevent the people from truly expressing themselves. Hence, ladies and gentlemen, I don't think it's an accident that very often, not always, but very often, populists call into question election outcomes either directly empirically when they say it must have been fraud, or at the very least on a moral level, saying that actually the other side winning isn't really legitimately possible. Again, I might bring up painful memories, but you will all remember how in November last year, the man who now occupies the White House said, well, if she wins, whether I'm going to accept it, I'll tell you at the time. Of course, everybody understood what that really meant. According to some surveys, 70% of Trump supporters said, if Hillary Clinton wins this election, it must have been rigged. Now, that kind of figure is bad news for any democratic political culture. Populists, in a sense, are always communicating to their supporters that if they don't win, it must have been rigged. Our democracy isn't really what it looks like. It's all a facade. There's always something else going on. There's always a kind of conspiracy. Now, don't get me wrong. Of course, any of us can criticize our existing institutions. Any of us can criticize our election system, our forms of representation, and so on. In fact, I think it's not difficult to agree that there's plenty to criticize. What one cannot do is to say, because I don't win or I didn't win, our democracy is somehow flawed. That's not a democratic argument. Okay, allow me to open the next chapter and say something about a situation when populists actually do win and when they actually get to power. There's a very widespread view among liberals, both in the sort of narrow sense in American political culture, but also in the wider sense that the term is used around the globe. It's a very widespread view among liberals that virtually by definition, populists cannot really govern because, after all, there are always protest movements. And by definition, once you get to power, you cannot keep protesting against yourself. Or a variation of that thought, they're all anti-elitists. So once you are in power, you of course have become the elite, and you cannot keep criticizing elites. Or another widespread view among liberals, all these people's policy ideas are so unbelievably simplistic that on day one of their time in government, it's going to become completely obvious to everybody that nothing works in practice, that the wall will not be built, that the free trade arrangements will not be changed, and so on and so forth. Well, I, for one, believe that this is a very naive view. We have enough examples in our time, from Turkey to Hungary to Poland to Venezuela to India to some degree, and maybe this country to some degree, to conclude that populists can very well govern. And specifically, they can govern as populists, which, if you find anything worthwhile in my approach, means as anti-pluralists, which furthermore means as actors who do not really truly recognize the legitimacy of any opposition. In fact, I would go a step further and say that what we've really seen in the last couple of years is the emergence of something that you might even call, if the term weren't so perverse, a kind of populist art of governance. Yes, these countries are all different. We shouldn't homogenize all these cases. But there are enough family resemblances for us to say, yes, they are part of a political family. There are patterns that they have in common. What do I mean? Well, the most obvious element in all this, I don't think it would surprise anybody, is that whenever these actors, these populist actors in government, are criticized by specifically independent, non-elected institutions, whether courts or free media, they tend to shoot back that, of course, they are elected, they and only they represent the people, and who elected these judges, and who elected these journalists. So they immediately deny the legitimacy of institutions, which most people are prepared to say, even though they're not elected, have an important role to play in a democracy. So far, so obvious. But there are three elements that are less obvious, although Jim already gave the punchline away to some degree about what they are. So first of all, it's very typical that these sorts of governments essentially try to capture the state itself, that they try to replace what in many countries should be a neutral civil service or bureaucracy with their own partisan actors. Now, some of you might come back to me and say, well, that's plausible, but hey, plenty of parties try to do that. That's not particularly populist. True, but the difference is that the practice that most other actors are trying at least to hide, because there's something shameful, problematic about it, populists very often do very openly, and with what in their mind is actually a moral justification. It goes back to their core claim to what you might call a moral monopoly of representing the real people. For, after all, the state is there for the people. So why shouldn't the people's only authentic representatives try to get the state and make it work for the people? Secondly, all these parties, when they can, when they have enough power, when there aren't countervailing forces that are strong enough, will also try to engage in what political scientists tend to call mass clientelism, which is just a highfalutin word for saying that these parties will try to reward their own supporters with material benefits or bureaucratic favors. Again, many of you might come back to me and say, well, yeah, but I mean, don't all parties sort of try to do that? Is that really so specifically populist? Again, the difference is that something that others are much keener to hide, populists can do very openly and with what in their mind is a moral justification. Remember that from the get-go, not all citizens are the people. Only some people are the people. So the fact that only those who agree with the populists get something from the state is not something peculiar or shameful or problematic. That's actually how things should be. The fact that everybody else is completely excluded is, in their mind, right and proper. Thirdly, whenever there is protest, it becomes, not least symbolically and morally, extremely important for populist governments to discredit that protest comprehensively, even if the protest poses no real challenge to their power. All these actors will end up doing something or engage in a strategy that I think it's fair to say was pioneered by Vladimir Putin. What am I talking about? I'm talking about the fact that, again, in line with their basic claim of a moral monopoly of representation, it simply cannot be true that parts of the people themselves are rising up against their only authentic, legitimate representatives. So how do you explain that situation? Well, the easiest way out is to say that what looks like civil society protesting out there, what looks like citizens engaging in demonstrations, is actually all steered and paid for by somebody on the outside. And then, the usual cast of characters is trotted out. It's the CIA that's behind it. It's George Soros, who's basically financing everything. Plenty of opportunities. In fact, there are no limits to creativity at all. Some of you may remember how during the Gezi Park protests in Istanbul, when many Turkish citizens basically came out explicitly against then Prime Minister Erdogan's sort of ideas about, how shall we put it, urban planning, the government immediately came out and said it's not really, Turkish citizens demonstrating in a bona fide way against these particular plans. No, it has all been organized by, obviously, Lufthansa, the German airline, which was afraid of additional competition from Turkish airlines after they opened this brand new airport outside Istanbul. And therefore, they always told a story about how every single protest leader had really just been to the German embassy to receive instructions about what to do, and so on and so forth. Now, I think it's worth saying that then also in this context, it is not entirely trivial if somebody says, well, of course he doesn't just say it, if somebody tweets that protesters, in this case against the so-called Muslim travel ban, are all, I'm quoting from memory, paid up activists. That's a kind of giveaway phrase. Of course, every politician in government faced by protest is going to say, we the government are right, the protesters are wrong. But that's categorically different from somebody who from the get-go denies the legitimacy, the good faith, the actual arguments of protest by immediately invoking a kind of conspiracy theory that explains why there can be any protest in the first place. Now, let me also in this context point out that, at least in my view, a lot of populist governments, but also populist parties and movements, have become a lot more sophisticated in how they address protest and opposition. Sometimes they kind of outright tell a story about conspiracy in the way that I was just outlining. But maybe more worryingly even, sometimes they've also found very interesting ways of incorporating protest into their own narratives, by which I especially mean their own narratives about a kind of ongoing culture war. After all, they always have to make it plausible to their supporters that they are the real people, and then there are all these sort of minorities that don't really belong, that, in the case of the protests in this country in January, are probably homeland-hating, homeland-betraying, liberal human rights, bi-coastal actors who don't truly belong to the US. If I may, let me give you a brief visual example of what I'm trying to get across in terms of this particular strategy of incorporating protest into a populist narrative.
à l'aveuglement, à la lâcheté et à l'inertie se substitueront la lucidité, le courage et l'action. Ne soyez ni anxieux ni abattus, soyez juste impatients. Les forces qui montent du pays sont puissantes, comme un instinct de survie. Je les crois irrésistibles. Des obstacles se dresseront devant nous encore. La bataille politique sera âpre, évidemment. Rien ne nous sera épargné, c'est une certitude. Ça a déjà commencé et je les pense capables des pires extrémités. Mais nous triompherons de tout cela. Et de ces batailles électorales naîtra une nation libre, fière, confiante, fraternelle, où il fera un nouveau bon vivre. Oui, de ce combat, la France renaîtra. À ceux, enfin, qui sont parfois saisis par le doute ou par la crainte, je rappellerai ces mots de Bernanos. L'espérance est un risque à courir. Vive la République! Vive le peuple! Et vive la France!
Be a word about context, if I may. This refers, or this basically depicts a ritual that no longer exists. The French National Front had a yearly event, 1st of May, where they laid a wreath at the statue of Joan of Arc in the 1st district of Paris. This was the last time this happened out in the open like this. Afterwards, they said that the danger of terrorism was so great that they couldn't do this outside anymore, and they replaced this kind of event with a banquet inside. The reason, though, I wanted to show you this is that, as I'm sure you've all noticed, something peculiar happened, sort of about 2/3 through. All of a sudden, the camera cuts to the balcony. You see these half-naked women unfurling these banners saying Heil Le Pen. And you probably would have guessed correctly that these were activists from Femen. This really happened like this. Well, it didn't quite happen like this. What you don't see here in this video is that the protest was suppressed extremely brutally by the security forces of the National Front. So these women were choked and had their hair pulled to basically remove them from the balcony. But what I think matters or is interesting is precisely that the propaganda, if I may call it that, doesn't deny the protest. It doesn't deny that this happened. It actually incorporates the protest into a particular narrative. Well, what narrative exactly? It's not just the general narrative about here are the real people and there are those who don't belong. I think it's more specific in this case. For surely it's also remarkable how most of the images of the front basically depict young French women. If you just watch this, you're going to say, oh, what is the National Front about? Oh, it must be a party that basically is about young people defending good Republican values of liberty, equality. Well, fraternity may be more difficult, but that's basically what these people are about. And if you ever have 2 minutes to waste in your life, just look at what Marine's father, Jean-Marie Le Pen, was doing at the same time. This is already after father and daughter split up, so to speak. And Jean-Marie also had an event around this statue. And if you watch his stuff, you think, his organization is basically for old, resentful, angry men who returned from the war in Algeria the day before. So this is a different image. And what they do with the Femen protest is, I think, specifically to suggest that here are two rival feminisms. Here is a healthy, good French feminism, and there is a weird other kind of feminism that, of course, in the dramaturgy of the video, is comprehensively defeated. Because by the end, everything is thrown down, and even if you listen to the music and watch the faces, it's this moment of relief that basically they're gone. And now everybody can basically, rest content with their properly French political program. So I think it's an interesting example of how there's no denial of protest. No, in a weird way, they make that protest work for themselves. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying, therefore, don't protest. It'll always be appropriated. There's nothing we can do. Not at all. But I think we have to wake up to the fact that a lot of these actors have become very sophisticated. They've become very sophisticated in their self-presentation. Anybody who watches the Jean-Marie version of all this, after 2 seconds is going to conclude that this is a racist organization. Not least because his video starts off with dark-skinned people running across borders, climbing walls, and wreaking havoc, and so on. With this stuff, I think it's a lot less obvious what is really going on. All right, allow me to close the chapter about populism and power. I hope it has become somewhat more plausible that no matter what is happening in this country right now, and by the way, we can talk more about this later, but I think plenty of stuff is happening. It's simply not true. What sometimes people now say, which is that, yeah, he's malevolent, but thank God he's also incompetent. I think it's a tragic misreading. There's plenty of stuff going on. It's just not quite the stuff that at the same time is going on in, let's say, Hungary, Poland, Turkey, where, yes, you really have an all-out disabling of independent institutions like courts and free media in the way that I was talking about earlier on. But there's still plenty of stuff happening, and I'm happy to talk about it later if you wish. But before getting to hopefully a debate, let me at least say a couple of words along the lines of something more positive and constructive. What can we possibly do? Well, I think when one looks at typical patterns of how politicians in particular have confronted populists, there have been sort of two extremes, which I believe are both mistaken in certain ways. The first extreme, especially in Europe, has been to say, okay, we will not engage with these actors at all. We're going to do total exclusion. So we're not going to appear together with them on television. If they ask a question in Parliament, we're not going to answer. We basically express maximum disapproval of populist actors. I think this is deeply problematic, not just on a strategic level, but also on, if you permit that expression, on the level of democratic theory. It's bad on the level of strategy because through this gesture, one is always bound to confirm the very narrative which populists serve up to their own supporters. The elites never listen, they're so afraid of us, they don't talk to us, you're not being listened to, and so on. It's exactly, in a sense, what they want to hear. But even on the level of democratic theory, once these parties are in parliaments, once they're represented, once they've been elected, to basically refuse any engagement with them whatsoever amounts to denying representation to all the citizens who elected them. And while we can be sure that populists are populists, because they themselves are telling us that they're populists with their anti-pluralist rhetoric, we cannot jump from that to the conclusion that all their voters are necessarily populists and anti-pluralists. Granted, it's a bit of a far-fetched example, but at least in theory, there's the possibility of a person who says, all this stuff here, I don't care. The stuff Marine Le Pen says about the other parties, that they're all corrupt, I don't believe that's true. But you know what? She has this fantastic agricultural policy ideas, and that's really why I'm going to vote for her. Granted, it's a far-fetched example, but I think somehow democratic theory has to account for that possibility. So total exclusion, I think, is the wrong way to go. To basically say, because you always exclude other people, we're going to exclude you, I think is the wrong stance. But so is the other extreme. Because in plenty of examples, politicians eventually, after having told their voters for many years, oh, these are always liars, demagogues, we don't believe a word of what they say, essentially decide to run after populists and to copy them in one form or another. Sticking with the French context, many of you will remember how Nicolas Sarkozy, in his failed attempt to become president again, basically decided that he was going to, if one can put it that way, out Le Pen. And of course, no matter how fast you run, you are never going to catch up with these actors. You're never going to please, let's say, the Danish People's Party or Geert Wilders in the Netherlands in terms of immigration policies, what you say about refugees, and so on and so forth. They're always going to, on a strategic level, reply by saying, look, see, they're all copying us. After telling, citizens for years that we were so terrible and undemocratic, and dictatorial maybe. Now they're copying us. And by the way, the original is still available. So why don't you vote for the original? This is why, again, on a strategic level, it's the wrong stance. But again, it's also wrong on the level of democratic theory. Because through these basically opportunistic concessions to populist actors, what one has seen in a whole number of countries, such as, for instance, the Netherlands and Denmark, is that a whole political spectrum has essentially shifted to the right without ever having been properly democratically authorized. It was always these sort of small opportunistic concessions that brought about the change. And then one day people wake up, let's say in Denmark, and they ask themselves, look, we used to be this open, tolerant country, and now look what happened. And we don't have an easy way back because, now that basically the spectrum has shifted so much to the right, we're not quite sure how we can reverse that process. There's also a sort of further related problem, which I think boils down to a fundamental misunderstanding of how democratic representation really works. Many mainstream actors, quite apart from this possible opportunism, essentially say, well, look, these populists are so successful, so maybe they know something about what is really going on in society that we don't know. So very often there's this switch from basically we don't believe a word of what they say to giving them a sort of sociological quasi-monopoly on telling us about, as the cliched phrase often goes, people's real sorrows and concerns. They know something that the so-called mainstream actors don't know. Well, democratic representation, at least in my view, is not best thought of as a kind of mechanical reproduction of people's interests, identities, and so on. So that one can basically say, there were these interests and identities out there, and now populists came and finally sort of transmitted them into the political system. No, democratic representation is a dynamic process where it's partly the offerings from politicians, but also from civil society, from friends and neighbors, family, and so on, shape people's self-perceptions. So if you think of the fact that since the traumatic memories of November 8th last year already came up, if you think of the fact that in Europe, for instance, on November 9th, plenty of people woke up and said catastrophe, but then also said, but maybe there's a bit of a silver lining because at last, we've been confirmed in what we always thought about the United States. It's a country full of racists, and now 63 million confirmed to us that, this is what we always suspected the US was about. Now, obviously, as I don't need to tell you, there are plenty of racists in this country. I don't need to tell you that Donald Trump indeed succeeded in making plenty of citizens perceive themselves as parts of something like a white identity movement. But a lot of this is not set in stone. These are not objective interests and identities which magically the populists finally discovered. As plenty of my colleagues in political science pointed out, well, how come that people voted for Obama twice and they voted for Trump? It can't quite be as simple as saying, they were always deeply committed to racism. We can talk about more about this later. But I think it's absolutely crucial, especially for left-wing parties around the world, not to basically say, well, they would usually say it behind closed doors, but plenty of them are saying it, that look, these right-wing populist parties, it's too bad, but they've really shown us that ultimately workers, they just don't like foreigners. That's just the way it is now. This is kind of objective now, and we're going to have to adapt to that in one form or another. I think that's committing the mistake of basically taking these outcomes to somehow reveal some deeper truth or something objectively given. Okay, after having gone on and on and on and on about what not to do, let me say at least one positive thing. So whether we like it or not, there are plenty of policy issues which can be debated inside a democratic spectrum. If you agree with me that populism is dangerous because it's anti-pluralism, then conversely we have to endorse pluralism, which also means there's going to be some stuff that we don't like. Well, I shouldn't talk about you, we as in we, but that I don't like, let's say. But if pluralism is serious, then it also means, okay, there's going to be a conflict about issues where hopefully, you know, as the force of the better argument will prevail, but where it would be wrong to say that, oh, you're not allowed to say this at all in a democratic debate about, let's say, immigration, refugees, certain points about the economy. So in that sense, the imperative is simply to engage with populists. But talking with them is not the same as talking like them. One doesn't have to share their premises. One doesn't have to sort of, you know, adopt the way they describe certain problems. But one has to have that open conflict. So far, so banal. What maybe is less banal is to say that whenever populists specifically reveal themselves as populists, it's absolutely crucial that other politicians, other actors, immediately draw a very thick red line. Example. If a populist actor, for instance, says that Angela Merkel, the German chancellor, has a secret plan to replace the German folk with Syrians, it's very important that other actors immediately say, wait a minute, we can disagree about immigration and refugee policy, perfectly legitimate, but now we've left the territory of normal democratic disagreement. Now we're doing something else. Of course, the populist will not recoil and say, oh, sorry, I didn't realize I was propounding a conspiracy theory. But it's not about him. This is a real-world example, as many of you will know. It's not about him. It's about citizens watching this. It's a pious hope of a democratic theorist, is that at least some people are going to say, okay, even if I like some of the positions that these people have, I don't really want to be in the same boat with people who constantly tell me that everything is a facade, everything is a conspiracy, and so on and so forth. Of course, that presumes quite a lot in terms of people's willingness to basically stick with the institutions against individual policy positions. But I think it's kind of the best hope we have in these sorts of situations. Now, let me very briefly say something about democracy after populism, which is to say, what are maybe the more structural issues that have come out through the successes of populist parties, and which we somehow, as good Democrats, I'll just include you as good Democrats if I may, we somehow have to think about more profoundly and more coherently. So two things in particular. I think it's fair to say, and I'm not the first person to say it for sure, that our time is also characterized by a conflict that by no means is entirely new, but it has become much more pronounced. What I'm talking about is a conflict, or as political scientists would put it, a cleavage between, on the one hand, those who in the broadest sense desire more openness, and that can take the rather cliched form of more economic and cultural globalization, but it can also mean more openness towards, let's say, religious, ethnic, and sexual minorities inside one's own country. So it doesn't have to be something international right away. And then on the other side, of course, those who, broadly speaking, want more closure. Now, this is not exactly the same as a conflict between populism and anti-populism, but it's a kind of conflict that works really well for populists. I think it's one of the explanations for why they've become so prominent, because these sorts of questions allow them to say, so the issue is inclusion and exclusion. Hey, we are the experts for exclusion. We can tell you who really belongs and who doesn't belong. We have answers, which is of course not to say that their answers are right, but they can say something. And if our conflicts were different, if, for instance, we took global warming really seriously, or if our conflicts were primarily about, let's say, bioethics, I don't think populists would say a lot, or would have a lot to say, beyond maybe, oh, don't trust the experts. But it wouldn't work for them as a kind of frame where they can say something. So one of the big challenges is, I think, to figure out whether one can talk about these sorts of conflicts in a democratic way, or, it's possible, whether we might have to conclude that actually no, the closure side is always going to end up in some way being illegitimate, being exclusionary in a way that simply cannot be tolerated in a democracy. So that's the first question I would pose for a discussion. The second issue, again, not something that's terribly new maybe, is that what we've learned in particular, I think over the last couple of years, is that profound changes in the media have at least been helpful for populists. Of course, the tweeter-in-chief told us himself, if you recall, I love Twitter because it's like having your own newspaper minus the losses, or with, characteristic modesty, I am the Hemingway of the 140 characters. I can do this much better than anybody else. But as many people I think have rightfully concluded, there is something going on that is meaningfully related to populism. What is it exactly? Well, I think what social media in particular have been doing for populists is to make something much more plausible, which they've always wanted, but which was much more difficult to achieve in the past. Namely the suggestion, or to put it more sharply, the illusion of an absolutely direct, unmediated connection with the individual citizen. Again, it comes down to the basic point about anti-pluralism. It's not an accident that so many populist actors say, we don't need the media, because the media, by mediating, always distort and bring in all these other points of view which are not the people's real will. And also we don't need, complicated debates and discussions inside political parties, because the people's will is always singular and obvious. There's basically nothing to discuss. Hence, it's not an accident that, for instance, a figure like Beppe Grillo in Italy always in the same breath criticizes the professional politicians and professional journalists, and basically has told people, again I'm quoting from memory, hey folks, it works like this, you tell me what's going on via his famous blog, and I'll be the amplifier. Now, by now many Italians have figured out that maybe it ain't as simple as that, but the suggestion is very strong. As I said, it did exist before, but it would have been an extraordinary event. It would have been maybe a party meeting that you went to for 3 or 4 hours. There was, let's say the person who you think is the great authentic representative of the people. There would have been the sense of direct connection, but it would have been something very exceptional and extraordinary. Now it's 24/7. Somebody wakes up 3 a.m., looks at Trump's tweets and says, oh, just what I was thinking. Well, more likely the other way around, but it doesn't matter. And this is, in a sense, an inherently kind of anti-pluralist setup that I think nobody, as far as I can tell, has figured out how to counter in some way or another. Now, to be sure, we've had plenty of debates about the supposed decline and fragmentation of the public sphere before. Classic debates in this country, for instance, in the 1950s and 1930s. If you read people like John Dewey, all the arguments are already there in terms of, the public sphere is constantly fragmenting. There's no sort of coherent democratic force anymore. People look at issues in totally different and confused ways. So it's not as new as one might be led to believe if one thinks that, oh, social media changed everything. But social media, that would be my thesis, did something in particular for populism that we have to account for and somehow come to terms with and ideally combat. All right, last point, if I may, because I promised you at the very beginning that I was going to go back to all these seemingly clear-cut narratives about, oh, the wave is going this way, no, the wave is going that way. Well, first of all, what about the story that we now have a seemingly unstoppable wave, or as Farage put it, tsunami? Well, that story was always deeply misleading, I think, because with all due respect, Nigel Farage didn't bring Brexit about all by himself. He needed his much more established conservative figures who basically told voters that, yes, he's a bit eccentric, but the case is sound. Here's Boris Johnson. Well, Boris Johnson's a bit funny too, but let's say Michael Gove, the man who famously went on British television in spring 2016 and said, this country is tired of experts. In the context, of course, of all experts having said that it was a bad idea to leave the European Union. And what's worth remarking in this context, I think, is that Michael Gove himself was always seen as a kind of intellectual among Tories. So it wasn't just the person from the street who told voters that expertise is overrated. No, it took an expert to tell people with credibility that expertise is not really what it's cracked up to be. In this country, at the risk of saying the obvious, Donald Trump did not become president as the candidate of a new third protest grassroots movement of angry white male workers. He was the candidate of a very established party. He also needed his very established, if you like, collaborators who basically vouched for him. I don't need to, tell you who they were. But it might also, in this context, be worth reminding ourselves that one of them, Newt Gingrich, appeared on television during the time of the Republican convention and said the usual things about crime is going through the roof, all this stuff. To which, of course, the CNN reporter at the time replied, well, look, the FBI statistics are showing the opposite. To which Gingrich said, you may believe in what theorists say, which for us was sort of news that the FBI is full of theorists and philosophers, but never mind. You may believe in what theorists say. I believe in what people feel. Now again, whatever else you think about him, I think it's worth pointing out that in the context of the American conservative movement, Gingrich is seen as an expert and an intellectual. And it took a particular kind of person to make this point about expertise. Long story short, what explains what happened exactly a year ago is ultimately something very banal. Partisanship. The fact that 90% of self-identified Republican citizens said, okay, this is the party I vote for, ergo, this is the man I vote for, is still, overall, the best explanation. Why is this important? Well, it's important because it's still the case, up until today, that nowhere in Western Europe or North America has a right-wing populist come to power without the collaboration, and I use that term consciously, without the collaboration of established conservative elites. In contexts where these elites have withheld their support, example, the Austrian presidential election, 2016, they have not come to power. So one always has to see that larger dynamic. And if we kind of build up a mythical image of a supposedly unstoppable quasi-natural force called populism, which will now destroy everything, we don't see that larger dynamic. And we don't hold certain people to account. Now, very briefly, why is the other story wrong as well? Well, if you find anything worthwhile in what I was trying to say at the beginning, there's a distinction between, on the one hand, populists claiming this moral monopoly of representation, on the one hand, and on the other hand, specific policy content. If you tell me what you think about immigration, about economic policy, free trade, the euro crisis, what have you, I cannot say you are or you aren't a populist. Policies in and of themselves are not populist or not. At the same time, of course, the two things are related. There's a reason why right-wing populists say certain things about immigration, borders, refugees, and so on and so forth. For after all, they need to give content to their conception of the real people and who doesn't belong, and so on and so forth. Yet it is important to hold on to the distinction, because we can have outcomes, as for instance in the Netherlands, where our official populist, if you like, Geert Wilders, doesn't win. And yet, at the same time, in the election campaign leading up to March 15th of this year, our nice, mainstream, supposedly also pro-European Prime Minister, Mark Rutte, put ads in all Dutch newspapers which said, behave normally or leave the country. This after his own Liberal Party slogan in the 80s had been, be yourself. So they've come along. They've come a long way. I hope you can see why I'm belaboring the point. Yes, the populist can lose, but a lot of policies that have an affinity with right-wing populism, in a sense, can still win. So we have to get away, ladies and gentlemen, from this very, very simplistic thing where now with every single election, at least across the West, maybe across the globe, all we ever ask is, oh, is populism up or is populism down? No, it's a much more complicated phenomenon, and the combination of who loses and who wins is not going to be as obvious as many media make it out to be. I'm sorry that I'm finishing on this rather maybe not so positive note, typical professor thing to say at the end. It's more complicated, of course, but I hope still that it can somehow aid us in comprehending our very messy political reality in 2017. Thank you for your attention.
Hi. Thank you so much for your talk. It was fascinating. My question is about the kind of political spectrum and how we understand right-wing populism versus left-wing populism. So I think in, you know, when Trump was elected, it was very, when everyone was like in a frenzy looking for reasons why he was elected, a lot of folks mentioned the Tea Party and kind of the rise of the Tea Party as being perhaps an inception of what we saw for his election. And then on the other side, we had, you know, Occupy Wall Street and what that meant for the rise of Bernie as a candidate. Can you comment a little bit about this distinction, and is there actually a distinction? Thank you.
Yes, thank you. So there is left-wing populism, because it may have sounded from the talk as if all this stuff only happens on the right. And especially in Europe, it's true that sometimes observers say, well, populism is bad and the left is always good, so by definition, left-wing populism cannot exist. That wouldn't be my view. And you only need to look at, you won't be surprised to hear about the example, Venezuela, to see really populist governance, where basically at one point it was no longer possible to disagree with Chavez without being told that you're a traitor to the country or to the project of 21st century socialism, and so on and so forth. So there can be, if you like, left-wing or more specifically socialist content to a particular kind of anti-pluralism. Having said that, a lot of the examples that are often mentioned in this country, but also in Europe and other parts of the world, when people then invoke left-wing populism, from my point of view, are simply not populist. And there is no symmetry between Bernie and Donald Trump. It's simply wrong to say that, oh, they sort of belong in the same category because, you know, one is sort of criticizing Wall Street from the left and the other is sort of criticizing the establishment from the right. Because criticism of elites is not the decisive criterion. The question is, are you an anti-pluralist or not? And one of these two characters is, and the other one isn't. And frankly, I'm often puzzled as to why people, not so much in the US, because as you all know, in the US, the word populism has a particular history. It historically goes back to the late 19th century when it was a shorthand also for saying, let's mobilize basically the downtrodden Main Street against Wall Street and so on. But in many other countries, people are now saying, oh, you know, should we counter right-wing populism with left-wing populism? Is that sort of, you know, the important way to go? And I'm genuinely puzzled as to what people mean by that. Sometimes they really seem to mean that, oh, things are so complex, you know, our usual constituencies don't understand what we're talking about, so we kind of have to make it simpler and sort of be more folksy or be more emotional. Now, even if you believe in these things, you sure as hell shouldn't announce it. This is like the Clinton campaign in 2015 saying, our plan for the fall is to make her look more human. I mean, even if that is your plan, you don't tell anybody about it. And basically, in the case of left-wing parties, just show a complete condescension vis-a-vis workers, other constituencies, and so on. And if it's basically just about mobilizing people on the ground in the way that, you know, the Tea Party is sometimes lauded for, as, you know, having, you know, can have a debate about AstroTurf versus grassroots and so on, but, you know, something did happen there. If that's the point, then simply say that. There's no reason to sort of use that particular P word if all you want to say is that we should be better at mobilizing people, getting people to vote, getting people out to be engaged, and so on. So in that sense, I think it's not a very helpful debate to say, oh, should we, you know, counter this with that, etc. Far too often also, I mean, I might have been guilty about this too in the later part of the talk, but also far too often when you look at the left, this whole thing is treated as if it were purely a matter of strategy and PR. So we have to sell our ideas better, or we need a new narrative for the European Union, or this sort of nonsensical stuff, as if it were simply, you know, a matter of let's get better PR people to kind of sell our case better, and not even spend a minute on the question of whether maybe it also has something to do with substantive policy choices, and with the fact that in many countries social democracy has lost credibility because they went far too much to the right on certain economic questions, and even if they say that they've changed, it has no credibility because people just feel that it's, you know, it's not a credible promise. And only if, last thing I'll say, only if basically you have a party truly hijacked by an outside force, i.e. Corbyn in the UK, does it reestablish a certain credibility for a left-wing program.
It's a very impressive speech, Professor. Here, Professor. I'm a senior researcher from Goethe University at Frankfurt. But I prefer ask this in English. My concerns is about the potential role of the populism in the global political economy. If in the elections, most of the populists would argue against globalization and ask liberal democratic government in the opposition part of the capitalism and also of the industrialists. But more or less, when they get elected, they sat around the round table with industrialists and asked them to coexist with them. So my question is, do you think it was it indicates a possible ally between this capital industrialist and this populism, or in the foreseeable future they will just get departed and run away? Thank you.
So I gather I have 3 hours now to answer this question. So I'm wary of, I mean, I'm not saying you proposed that, but in general, I'm wary of anything that looks like a monocausal explanation at the level of, who votes for these parties. Do we have very clear pattern? I don't think we do. It's not the economy stupid, to coin a phrase. Yes, very often there are some patterns that people who, one could plausibly think of as not the actual, as the cliched phrase goes, the actual losers of globalization, but as potential losers of globalization, tend to agree with some of the promises that some of these actors make. So I'm not saying it's all random or kind of, we can't say anything at all. But I think, again, going back to the left in general, I think one has to be very wary of what has become very popular as a very simplistic account where people basically, like August Bebel, the German social democrat in the late 19th century, say it's the socialism of fools. It's people who haven't understood that neoliberalism is the real enemy. All we have to do is re-educate them a little bit to kind of make them understand who the real enemy is, and then they're going to come back to us. By all means, the left should make the points it wants to make about how globalization is not what it was cracked up to be in the 90s by those who were promoting it. But to think that this is a sufficient strategy is, I think, mistaken. And it also very often has a distinct normative cost, because it's going to mean that also sometimes at least the left will simply become more nationalist or sort of engage in more people talk without that really generating necessarily much of a payoff. Let's go back to the example I presented you with earlier this evening. So if you look at the campaigns of Jean-Luc Mélenchon, and you compare his 2012 and his 2017 campaigns for the presidency, they were very distinct. He actually, I think, listened to his advisors who said, you got to do left-wing populism, i.e. you got to be less universalist. You got to talk more about peoplehood. You got to talk more about sort of France itself. And the result, as a number of studies have shown pretty conclusively, is that no, voters for Marine Le Pen did not come back to the left. He did extremely well, but mainly by attracting socialist voters who were totally disillusioned with the socialist party. So therefore, I think it's too simplistic to think that this is basically reducible to economic factors. Having said that, the other element that you alluded to is of course right. That when in many times when these people come to power, they absolutely don't make good on their promises. Very often there's a kind of theater of national sovereignty. So some companies in, let's say, Hungary are renationalized and then privately sold off to favored oligarchs. This sort of stuff. But a lot of the actual policies, I think it's fair to generalize, are very neoliberal in the end. So by all means, it's important to point that out. What maybe is also, very last point worth reflecting on, is that, of course, many people, of course, have puzzled about this, is how can it be that here's somebody who gets elected on a supposedly anti-elitist platform, and then the cabinet is full of, well, you know who. Well, maybe one explanation, I'll just present this to you as a hypothesis, I'm not saying this can be proven, is that at least in some countries, by which I mean here primarily, it's not necessarily a global anti-elitist sort of effect. It's more specifically anti-professionalism. So, of course, with the Wall Street guys and the military, you can say, well, look, you can sort of quantify that they are really competent, they've achieved something. The money is there, and the generals, okay, they haven't won any wars recently, but at least they haven't lost them too badly. Professionals, where you cannot quantify, that's the problem. And of course, the fact that Hillary Clinton was the ultimate professional of sorts in politics might have something to do with this. So I think it's worth reflecting on what at least I think is a paradox, that we live on one level, we live in very anti-authoritarian times. But anti-authoritarian doesn't mean progressive in our circumstances.
Obviously, without reducing it to just one cause, you can look at terrorism, disruptive migratory patterns, globalization. I'm particularly interested in automation's connection to the populist movements because I see this as an increasingly prevalent phenomenon across industries. Doesn't matter what it is, how creative, how specialized. Do you see this connection on a correlative level as valid? Because maybe not as direct, but in terms of the populist scapegoating these jobs that have been automated and they won't come back to the other, to whether it's the Mexican, the Chinese, or do you find this connection invalid on any level?
I'd be reluctant to say your suggestion is invalid on all levels. I'm not going to say that. It's of course very plausible that this, in a sense, again, provides an opening for populists, and at the same time we have to say, oh, not everybody who criticizes certain developments is therefore automatically a dangerous populist. Since I have nothing more to say about this particular question, let me say something else in addition, if I may. One thing that maybe some of you have been asking themselves is, well, how come that all these movements and also all these populist governments, they seem to remain committed to democracy. So it's very different from a situation where somebody says, okay, democracy is over, we'll now do dictatorship, or we follow China and do Leninist consumerism, and so on. No, they all remain committed to the right principles. Under the circumstances, I think a lot of people, up until recently, would have said, this is a classic case for civil disobedience, where basically you think, okay, the society shares the right ideals, we just need to basically make it plausible to people that this government is unjust, that this is why it's undemocratic, and so on and so forth. And yet, interestingly, in very few cases have we seen comprehensive mobilizations around civil disobedience, let alone ones that have become very successful. So why is that? Well, again, more by way of an hypothesis, I think it has something to do with the fact that in these classic accounts of civil disobedience, from Rawls to Habermas and beyond, one thing was always taken for granted. You did this publicly, and you did it with a view to publicity and to generate as much publicity as possible. And that can no longer be taken for granted in situations where governments have purposefully reduced media pluralism, or where, as in this country, one has extremely fragmented public spheres. So we all love a particular Danish fairy tale, where it just takes one child to point out that the emperor has no clothes. But of course the premise of the fairy tale is also that everybody can hear the child. And very often we now have contexts where what we assume everybody must know is simply not known to a lot of people. And I mean, some of you probably know this much better than I do as specialists on this question. But even the idea that, there's a sort of right-wing public sphere and a left-wing public sphere, so here you're going to get a spin from the left and there a spin from the right, in our day and age is hopelessly naive, because certain topics will simply not show up in certain contexts. So it cannot be taken for granted that everybody has heard about certain things, and then we can argue about what these certain things mean. Again, on a pessimistic note, I think that's one of the most structural challenges, where nobody at this point has found any plausible answer. It's perfectly nice and well-meaning, and it's a good thing that Carl Sunstein now says, great to have a button on the internet where you push it, and that's going to give you the contrary opinion. But I don't think this is going to get us back into anything that would resemble a halfway coherent public sphere, which remains, in a sense, a precondition for functioning democracies, where basically a functioning public sphere is a stand-in for the people as a whole, who can never appear together, but where the public sphere is sort of the second best thing. I know I didn't answer your question, but I hope I said something else that was mildly interesting.
Thank you very much for the talk. Coming from Brexit land, it's very useful to have such a clear analysis. But it was very much, as I understood it, an analysis of, if you can put it like this, populist elites and the strategies they adopt, with very little, although you started to talk about it now in terms of questions, about the conditions which might make these populist elites attractive to voters across the world. And I'd like you to reflect on it. And I think it's important because unless we take these range of conditions, I know you're going to say it's not just the economics, but unless we take these conditions very seriously, then I think we don't know really how to deal with justifiable complaints. Because you said that, that when populists lose, they often talk about democracy being rigged. But the fact is, I and many millions of people who don't vote for right-wing populists genuinely believe democracy is rigged. In the US, money dictates. There was an article in the New York Times today from a Democrat saying that Trump was elected because the election was rigged, because African-American voters in key states weren't allowed to vote. So unless we start to talk about what was wrong that allowed populists to exploit these conditions, how are we ever going to start to deal with a problem? It smacks of a complacency of the great phrase you used of the extreme center.
Again, I wish I had 3 hours to try to provide an answer. I agree with you that it's important to think about these preconditions and not kind of, sort of say basically, oh, something crazy came out of nowhere. No, I mean, there is a reason why some of these claims and demands gain traction. And to sort of use more extreme examples, it would be idiotic, to put it bluntly, to think that, oh, Venezuela, perfectly egalitarian society, then crazy Chavez comes along, screws it all up. Turkey, perfectly pluralist, open society, then crazy Erdogan comes along, screws everything up. No. I mean, there are real things going on, but as I was trying to say during the talk, one has to be extremely careful with that analysis and not do what I think many people, not you, but many people sort of I think sometimes do, which is to basically lazily adopt the populist descriptions of their own success. Because we always say, oh, they are the simple-minded ones. But of course, it makes our life easier too if we basically buy their explanations and not do a more careful analysis. So I think it's very important to disaggregate these different factors. It's important to bear in mind that nationally they're often different. Even though it can look like there's this global phenomenon, I think national contexts still matter a great deal. So the reason, let's say the reasons for the rise of a Jörg Haider in Austria in the 80s are not the same as the reasons for a rise of Jean-Marie Le Pen, are not the same as the reasons for Donald Trump, and so on and so forth. So that's one thing. Then these structural changes in the public sphere matter. And yes, I wouldn't say, oh, the economy doesn't play any role at all. The only thing I would say is that there's no sort of clear link between that and populist successes. And I think if one makes that link too strongly, one either adopts the wrong political strategy, as the left sometimes does, or even worse, one basically says, oh, there are these policies which are basically populist. And then given that, at least in some parts of the world, including the UK, populism still has a pretty bad name, one basically ends up saying, well, yeah, these ideas probably are sort of bad, are going to harm the economy and so on, as opposed to very clearly saying, look, it has nothing to do with populism. These are genuine questions about distribution, about who actually benefits from certain economic arrangements, and so on and so forth. And I worry that very often today, on the political spectrum, the default response to populism has been a form of technocracy. So one basically opposes these actors by saying, look, but here we have the rational policies and they have irrational policies. Or even worse to some degree, they're always lying and we have the truth. I mean, you all, I think, can think of websites of major newspapers where, as soon as you click, something pops up that says, if you care about the truth, subscribe now. And by the way, the truth is 60% off today. So, do it right away. I think that's strategically and also, again, at the level of democratic theory, it's a fatal mistake. Because technocracy is going to in turn make it easier for populists. Again, it becomes a vicious circle where basically technocrats say there's only one rational solution. If you disagree with our economic policy, you reveal yourself to be irrational. That's going to make it easier for populists to come back and say, wait a minute, democracy without choices? Where are the people in this? So they're going to become stronger. That in turn is going to make technocrats say, oh look, you give people a choice, they vote for crazy people. We have to take even more decisions away from the people. So it goes round and round, and we're going to get this competition of what looks like two extremes, but what actually is a competition of two phenomena that have one thing in common, because they're both forms of anti-pluralism. So the technocrat says only one rational policy, the populist says only one authentic will of the people. So, I mean, it's not very original to criticize Tony Blair, but I think it was in a sense symptomatic when I think during the summer he published his op-ed piece where he said, okay, we have to rally against these crazy populists on the right and on the left, and we basically have to, get all reasonable people in the center together and sort of be bipartisan, have bipartisanship among the reasonable. Clearly not realizing that maybe the third way rhetoric had something to do with the rise of populism. And this, by the way, just a footnote, I think is also a real danger with Macron, that basically he now presents what he wants to do as here's only one choice, here's the reasonable center, which is also why you can have people from the left and the right collaborate in this reasonable center, and everybody else is a crazy extremist. I think that is a frame, especially if then it's seen to fail, is going to give us indeed another burst, if you like, of populism.